Psychological horror is a subgenre of horror that predominantly focuses on unsettling and disturbing depictions of a person's mental state. Like the horror genre itself, the psychological horror subgenre has consistently grown in quality over the past couple of decades, as improvements in gaming technology have let developers create frighteningly immersive experiences. Today on Game Rant, we're showing off 6 of the best psychological horror games. First up, Inscription. A roguelike card game hiding a much more sinister secret, Inscription's haunting atmosphere and deep-seated mystery make for one of the most compelling indie titles in recent history. It takes a while for the supernatural to rear its ugly head in Inscription, but the game executes this part of the game flawlessly. Without getting into spoilers, there's a reason those who have finished this game evangelize it, and even more so, why they tell new players that jumping in blind is the optimal way to experience this masterpiece. Next up, Outlast. Like many indie horror games from the past decade, Outlast can attribute much of its success to streamers and influencers, who would have large audiences watching them to see their horrified reactions to many of the game's scariest moments. Along with a handful of jump scares, Outlast also aims to frighten its players by not letting them use weapons, meaning their only choice is to run and hide, creating some extremely tense moments. Outlast received a sequel in 2017, which struggled to have the same impact as its predecessor, but it's certainly worth checking out for fans of the first game. Next on our list, Soma. Soma was released in 2015 by Frictional Games, the same company that made the psychological horror game Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Consequently, the game was highly anticipated by psychological horror fans, which, as mentioned before, can make it difficult for developers to unsettle players, as they already know roughly what to expect. Frictional Games did a fantastic job of subverting expectations, however, by misleading players in a much more subtle way. The game begins with the protagonist suffering a serious brain injury and agreeing to let a doctor perform experimental treatment on them, which results in them waking up in an unfamiliar, eerie place. Seasoned psychological horror fans will have perked up a little bit at the brain injury, and many will have expected the protagonist to have awoken in some sort of manifestation of their inner thoughts, an expectation that the developers were likely leading players down. Instead, what follows is a Black Mirror-like look into the possibilities of technological advancements. Up next, Alan Wake. Alan Wake was initially released exclusively on Xbox 360 in 2010 before coming to PC just under 2 years later. In October 2021, a remastered version of the game was released with both DLCs on most modern platforms. The game's psychological horror story takes a healthy dose of influence from Stephen King, who is referenced in the game's opening. This is particularly clear in the abundance of supernatural enemies and occurrences present, which accompany the story's focus on a writer worried that he's losing his mind. Next, Hellblade: Senous Sacrifice. Hellblade: Senous Sacrifice was developed by Ninja Theory and is an unorthodox psychological horror game in the sense that, unlike most in the genre, it doesn't take place in the modern day with an immediately relatable protagonist. It's instead set in a dark fantasy world inspired by Celtic and Norse mythology. Despite this fantasy setting, the game's story focuses on the all-too-real mental illness of psychosis. Hellblade's depiction of psychosis, which was constructed with the help of neuroscientists, has been central to the game's praise, and a sequel is coming out in just a matter of weeks. And finally, Silent Hill 2. As mentioned before, psychological horror games are, generally speaking, getting better and better as technological advancements allow developers to create more detailed, immersive, and ultimately scarier horror experiences. This serves as a reminder as to how special of a game Silent Hill 2 is, as, despite being released over 20 years ago, it still offers some of the best horror experiences in gaming. This is predominantly due to how great Silent Hill 2's storytelling is, as the journey of discovering what happened to Mary is still as interesting today as it was upon release, while the depiction of James' psyche remains one of gaming's best visual storytelling elements to date. Silent Hill 2 is getting a remake later this year, so it's a better time than any to jump into the story of James Sunderland. From card games to ageless classics, those were our picks for 6 of the best psychological horror games. Thank you for watching Game Rant. I'm Cameron, and we'll see you next time.